Welcome, everyone, to the UCI Latin American Studies Center roundtable, special roundtable on crosscurrents in the study of Latin America and East Asia. I'm Heidi Tisnman. I'm in the History Department, and I'm joined today by two colleagues, Professor Gustavo Oliveira from Global and International Studies, and Professor Keiji Kunigami from Film and Media Studies. Also joined, of course, by our fearless director of the Latin American Studies Center and my comrade and fellow traveler in the History Department, Alex Baruki. This is, the point of today's meeting is really to have a chance to look at some of the new debates that have emerged around new scholarship on intersections between Asia and Latin America. And it's nice to have an intimate group to do that with. I am going to just the inspiration for this panel, and I thank Alex for organizing it, couldn't be more timely. And it is fitting that UCI should have this conversation, since we have long had strengths in Latin American studies and Asian studies, and many departments in social science and humanities have been working for some time now at the cross sections of transnational studies, global studies, world history. We have all taken the global and transnational turn in multiple ways, and both Keiji and Gustavo's work, also, where appropriate, I'll talk a little bit about my own work. We are all working on the new frontiers of cross sections between, crossovers between Latin American studies and Asian studies. In the last decade and a half, there's been an explosion of new work in this area. The Latin American Studies Association now has a formal Asia and the Americas section. In fact, it's existed for some years, and it's quite large. Academic presses are now churning out any number of books on Chinese and Japanese diasporas in Mexico and Peru, Brazil, as well as on relations between Asian and Latin American nation states and business actors, cultural brokers, etc. This marks a huge sea change in area studies. Once upon a time in the dark ages in the 20th century, when I came of age intellectually, Latin American studies was precociously global and transnational in its framing, but it looked to transnational connections or transregional connections to Europe and the United States principally. Europe in terms of Portuguese and Spanish colonialism, the United States in terms of legacies of imperialism, and in studies of slavery, to Africa, briefly to Africa, we might say, and that of course has changed as well. But the region, as it was imagined by Latin American studies in the North Atlantic anyway, was very much imagined, with the absence of Asia. That, I'm happy to say, has really changed. And the new kinds of studies that I see coming out of, any number of disciplines are thinking about the Pacific world in new ways, are rethinking the concept of mestizaje and its long exclusion of Asianness, and it's kind of the way in which mestizaje in Latin America is intentionally built on Asian exclusion. Anyway, a whole number of things. I'm getting ahead of myself, but this is just all to say that it's exciting to come together and have a conversation in a roundtable way about new tendencies that bring studies of Asia and studies of Latin America together. The way this format is going to work is I'm going to briefly introduce our main speakers, and then I'm going to ask them some questions and also entertain follow-up questions from the audience. Just a few more things about Dr. Gustavo Oliveira. Dr. Oliveira is assistant professor in the UCI Department of Global and International Studies. He obtained his PhD in geography from UC Berkeley, and he was visiting assistant professor of economic geography at Peking University. His current book project examines Chinese investments in Brazilian agribusiness and related infrastructure. Dr. Keiji Kunigami is a new member of the UCI faculty. Welcome. Assistant professor in the Department of Film and Media Studies here in Humanities. He obtained his PhD in Asian Studies from Cornell University, and before was Doctoral Research Fellow of the Japan Foundation. His work focuses on Brazilian and Japanese cinema and the relation between filmic forms and the political peripheral modernisms and yellowness and raciality of Brazil. And I'm Heidi Tisnman in the History Department. I work on gender and labor in modern Latin America. My prior work has been on women workers in Cold War Chile, but I have taken a pivot and have for the last many years been working on a project about Chinese contract labor and nation making in 19th century Peru and Chile. So Keiji and Gustavo, welcome. I wanted to invite you both just to say a few more things about your projects, what you're working on, and what most excites you in your work about an encounter between, studies of Asia and studies of Latin America. Sorry. Keiji, why don't you go first, and then Gustavo.
Okay, thank you, Heidi, for the very nice introduction, and thanks everybody. Thanks, Alex, for having this idea, Latin American Studies Center, for welcoming me right in the beginning when I had just arrived. You reached out. It was really nice. So my work, this introduction, Heidi's introduction of the field was very thorough. It was very good. I thought it was. I don't know, very informative. So my work, so explaining a little bit, because my work kind of also went through a certain, shift. So kind of I'm gonna give a sort of chronological account. So actually I started working, so my interest in doing this Asia, Latin America bridging comes first from my perception very early on of the need for the dislocation of the usual center, right, of comparison and of study of Latin, as Heidi was saying, from Europe, or Latin America in relation to Europe, Latin America in relation to the US, and usually when the study of raciality would go always through the study of Africa and the Black Atlantic, right, and I always felt a certain absence of putting these other two things together, which was Latin America and Asia, right? And that that was always a question that was in me since undergrad, grad school. I started grad school already with the intent of putting these two things together, actually. And I really had the firm belief that bringing Latin America and Asia together would actually provide new questions and provide new possible theoretical frameworks in order to understand historical processes and aesthetic processes and the interaction of things. So this was one thing, starting point. And the other was also a certain discontentment with area studies in itself. And, of course, as we all know, being an epistemological framework that is, that responds to geopolitical interests that are colonial in itself. So I always had a certain problem with understanding historical processes through like national lenses, and also in a way the very category of region, right? So I would have the, you know, it's very um, you would have like studies of East Asia within Asia, within East Asia, or East Asian nations within East Asia, and Latin American nations within Latin America, when the intent was to like move away from north south comparison, it would always stay within a region. So that was also something that kind of like prompted me to like put Asia and Latin America together. I mean, this is the specifically academic, you know, point of departure, right? And so, and then my research started from looking at avant-gardes. So I'm a film studies person, so film studies, visual culture. So I've always looked at political and historical processes through the lens of, you know, visual studies and the image processes of like technology and media. Um, so I was initially interested in bringing together the ways that the avant-gardes of the 20s and the 30s in Japan and Brazil uh, theorized film, and through theorizing film, theorized the vision and the body, right? And so I started my initial impulse was to not do a diaspora studies, for example, framework, right? Was to move away from this framework in order to actually understand processes that went parallel. And I thought that would illuminate certain, you know, um, especially like processes of theory formation around the image and around technology, considering cinema, right, at the center. And so I started from this path, right? And I was also trying to find the limits, kind of do a critique of comparison in itself. Um, so yeah, so I started by like taking this approach of like understanding parallel processes of receiving of the filmic technology and of film theory in itself, and how actually you would find similar discourses, you know, around the role of vision and how it impacted the body. And but then also like while I was doing this is my initial dissertation research, right? And then I was doing this research, I would just encounter this very deep anxiety related to race, right? In both cases, of course, the whiteness was at the center, but it was always like a certain anxiety. So the body in relation to the moving image was always mediated by the effect of race, right? And also, of course, but I started from the idea of like the understanding of an anxiety around not being modern, not being European, right? So that was a starting point, especially looking at two, you know, um, geopolitical major players, empire or semi-empire national projects, Brazil and Japan, and how they actually kind of like represented themselves and thought of themselves, the elite, right? I'm talking about the avant-garde, so it were the elite classes, how they actually understood themselves as the representatives of modernity, and how film was so important in this process. But like while I would go deeper in the archive and looking at the film theories and film essays of these intellectuals in the 20s, I would just several times I would just encounter race. So then my project shifted a little bit, and then I started to pay more attention to the effect of yellowness, right, which was something that emerged very strongly with the encounter of the Japanese modernist intellectuals with film. And it was at the same time, yellowness was a fact being debated in Brazil, right? And especially yellowness as this intermediary mediation between whiteness and blackness, right? So yellowness being that race that is doomed to disappear. Like it was only brought to Brazil in order to disappear and become whiteness. And then I would see also some difficulties around the photographic image of yellowness, in Brazil. So I started seeing these connections, and also how yellowness actually started to work as a mediation itself, as a technology of mediation, and sometimes also as the filmic technology itself, right? The place where they would expose the filmic technology. So this idea of the intermediariness of yellowness and the intermediality of yellowness started to like stand out for me, and how it worked in both sides of, you know, in both Brazil and Japan, right? So, and of course, it was related to also like interest that I had in relation to the temporality of race, right? Especially considering the miscegenation project in Brazil. So, and then I started to like finding a theoretical framework that was, that would like bind these two things together, but still not being necessarily related to questions of cultural identity, for example, which is a very, I think it's the most common framework adopted when you study like Japanese Brazilian, so Japan and Brazil, or the relation between Asia and Brazil, is through like discourses of cultural identity. And I was really more interested in the idea of race instead of culture, right? And how it worked through technology of visuality. So this is the process of like what I had in the beginning of, well, maybe putting these two things together will actually create or give space to some more like interesting frameworks in order to understand global circulation of theories and of ideas, as well as of images. And so that's how like, that's actually the framework that I got to through this process of the initial kind of discomfort with the usual being repeated, right? Sorry, I spoke too much, but that's it.
No, not at all. And we're gonna circle back for more. I want to invite people. I do have like 4 questions that I'm gonna put on the table sequentially, although it's fine if we get distracted. I want to invite, since we're an intimate group, and that's great actually, if you have your own questions, you can put them in chat, and we might not get to them immediately, but feel free to post them there, and I can try to keep track of them. Gustavo, let's pivot to you. Tell us about what you're working on specifically right now in terms of Asia and Latin America, and what you're most excited about regarding, this encounter, or Crosscurrents, which is our topic.
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much. Thanks, Alex, for putting it together, for running the entire center. Thanks, Heidi, for facilitating and having this conversation. It's great to be on a panel with you. I really look up to your work. And Keiji, welcome. So great to finally be with you, even if it has to be in this pandemic style. Great to see old friends here, new friends. I'm especially really, truly honored that Evelyn joined us. Thank you so much. It's great to see Felipe here, who may be joining us as well, and everyone else. Some people, also great to meet you. So my work right now, I'm trying to really finally get my dissertation out as a book. That's really the main thing I'm doing. I completed my dissertation.
That's what you're excited about.
Well, there's other work that I'm also very excited about.
That's right. No, it's good.
Because now, since I can't go back to Brazil, I can't go back to China, I've actually pivoted to start researching the impact of the pandemic on our food supply chains here in California as well. And I'm quite excited in the future to connect this work that I'm doing on pandemic disruptions to our food supply chain in the US to similar processes in Brazil, across Latin America, in China, and so forth. But that's part of a team project. That's where I play a role. It's not the core of my own research, and it's also not where I find my own particular contribution to be most evident. I think that really is in the topic of my doctoral research, which I've continued to develop, which is the study of Chinese investments in Brazil, especially in agribusiness and related infrastructure like ports, warehouses, possibly railroads. And what I'm going to be doing for one of my next book-length projects is to have less focus in agribusiness and agriculture and look at infrastructure more broadly and capital. So I've been also looking at Chinese banks that are setting up shop in Brazil, also investments, for example, in hydroelectric dams. That's a big deal in Brazil, especially in the Amazon region, and associated power lines. So things that really are taking me beyond agrarian studies. But what I want to say that is most exciting for me about doing this work and the way that I try to approach it, I think has some resonance with Keiji's motivation in his work too, which is that a lot of the work that I've seen done, and we can talk more about this later, in terms of like China-Brazil relations or Latin America, East Asia relations, is largely framed from kind of an international relations perspective, where it's kind of government to government relations, diplomacy, macroeconomic data, big national level data, and the humanity kind of gets lost in the detail. On the other hand, you might find some other work more from the humanities or humanistic social sciences that really kind of look at, say, diaspora studies, you know, or some of those connections, but they don't necessarily so often or so easily or so clearly or so well make those connections to geopolitics, to global agro-industrial restructuring, to the, you know, the political economic transformations associated with, say, the US-China trade war and so forth and so on. And I'm trying to put my work at that intersection. I try to use global ethnography, I try to use ethnographic methods to understand these big picture issues of geopolitics, of global political economy, and so forth and so on. And in order to do that, I have to carry out a very different type of ethnography than our colleagues oftentimes in anthropology tend to do. This is not a village study. It's not like I chose, you know, one case or one place that will exemplify that kind of thing. Any place I found Chinese capital flowing into agribusiness and related sectors in Brazil, I try to trace it out. I try to go to the place, field site. I try to engage with social movements, NGOs, all kinds of political ecological struggles happening on the ground to understand what's the kind of political and ecological context in which that's taking place. I try to also then trace the life histories, the company histories in China and their partners in Brazil, and really try and understand how, where, and why these different business deals get done, which meant that I also studied dud deals. I also studied when the deals don't work. I also studied when it was that some investment practices, some investment projects would collapse, and the government to government relations that tried to articulate them, as well as a lot of the political economic contestations that maybe weren't even perceived as involving a Chinese actor because they own a transnational conglomerate that has a subsidiary that has just a local face company there. Nonetheless, the particular practices that are unfolding are very much tied to these broader processes that I was looking at. So for me, that's what's kind of exciting. It's kind of, on the one hand, putting meat and bones to that kind of IR, macro econ kind of literature, but on the other hand, also showing how the kind of nuanced, humanistic, more qualitative, you know, human scale approach is necessary and informative for us to tackle these, you know, big picture questions.
Yeah, no, that's great. You know, before I move to the next question, I just wanted to piggyback on what you were saying, Gustavo, in terms of my own work and what I'm excited about, this kind of bringing different literatures together and the opportunities that are, you know, allowed through projects like this. So I'm writing this history of Chinese contract labor in the making of modern Peru and Chile. Now, I am not the first person to write on contract labor in Latin America. There is a really rich and venerable tradition of doing just that. In fact, Evelyn Hudahart is here, who has written, you know, some of the most important work in English on contract labor in Cuba and Peru, also Mexico. What's exciting for me about my project is kind of bringing what was a very important materialist labor history tradition of the 1980s that Evelyn is very much part of, as well as many other things, of course, as well. But there was a kind of boom in studying Chinese laborers on plantations in Cuba and in Peru, less on Peru, but especially on Cuba in the 80s. Also, some of the key actors in this boom were Latin American intellectuals, Juan Pérez de la Riva and Humberto Rodríguez Pastor in Peru. We actually know quite a lot about what was going on plantations. However, this literature wasn't, I mean, it got read, it was valued, it was celebrated, also within the kind of canonical portraits of the labor traditions of Peru or, Mexico, very much a, kind of side story. Those of us who are Latin American labor historians have always, or have long known about the importance of Chinese labor. It's in the footnotes, there's key important studies, but the way in which the nation, the kind of canon of the nation got narrated, saw intended to take these very important studies on Chinese labor and see them very much as footnotes, as side stories, as these kind of like momentary blips when there was a reliance on contract labor and then it all went away. And oh, how interesting that some people are working on the Chinese. That's nice. Now let's get back to the main story about the Indians in Peru, or about the Afro-Cubanos in Cuba, or about, the mestizos after the revolution in Mexico, right? In this moment we're in, we have the opportunity to totally, go back to that materialist tradition and think about it in new ways. One of the literatures that I've really enjoyed engaging over the last decade is Asian American studies, and the way in which Asian American studies has become more transnational. Asian American studies, along with other studies of racial formation in the United States, have very rich and sophisticated ways for thinking about the politics of race and nation. They tend to be less materialist, or at least in the last 20 years, right? In the, in the 20th century, they were all doing labor studies too. But there's been a way in which, I'm generalizing broadly, that studies of diaspora, racial formation, and the politics of culture in the last 10 or 15 years have tended to, they certainly flag the importance of labor, but they're not within those materialist traditions. So I'm interested in bridging those, right? And it's exciting because there is, lots of new and exciting work being done, both by people who are situated within Asian American studies, those of us who are more situated in Latin American labor history traditions. And the third literature is, whatever, especially as a second project, or this is my third project, we can get away with a lot of our sources are reading the scholarship of our colleagues, right? One of the other exciting literatures I've gotten to engage is reading the social history of China. And using social histories of labor, war, gender in 19th century and early 20th century China, and using that to interpret Latin American archives about Chinese people. So that, I'm not a Mandarin speaker. I do not do research in Mandarin, although I did do some initial language study in Mandarin. I cannot read documents in Mandarin. Nonetheless, most of the documents about Chinese in Peru are actually in Spanish and in English. But the China historiography is absolutely essential for, kind of trying to understand what's going on, in Latin America. This is a point Madeline Chu from Asian American Studies makes, that we just leave so much on the table if we don't read across fields, right? So, I am excited about the ways in which we're encouraged at this particular intellectual moment in time. It's not just to challenge like how area is imagined, all that, although certainly we're doing that, but we're really called upon to read, outside our field, or to claim for our own field, literatures that, would have been considered completely outside our area. Oh, I'm not an expert on 19th century China. Well, I know a lot about 19th century China. Now, I'm not a scholar of China, but I read tons of books about it, because that helps me understand what's going on in Peru. So anyway, enough of that. I wanted to ask you guys, okay, so what? Or what is the, we're having this encounter. How does having studies of Asia and studies of Latin America encounter each other in our scholarship, how does that specifically help us rethink field, or, you know, why does it matter to think about Latin America as part of the Pacific world as distinct from the Atlantic world? Or, I mean, maybe if we're sitting in Asian studies, you know, if I had more of my China history colleagues here, I would ask them, you know, what does it matter to think about Japan and China as part of the South American Pacific? What comes into view differently in our projects if we kind of take that seriously, right? I'm also curious, maybe, you know, maybe this is a North Atlantic conversation, right? I don't know if do intellectuals in Brazil care about the paradigm, the Pacific world? And what does the Pacific world mean in, you know, down in Brazil? I don't know that I can say in Chile. Well, there's a conversation about El Mundo Pacífico, and certainly about Chile's relationship with China. So it's certainly not that they're not interested, but the particular, you know, way it gets a Pacific world as distinct from Atlantic world, I think of that as also emerging from a particular kind of North Atlantic framing, but maybe I'm wrong. Anyway, just your thoughts about the bigger picture. How do projects like your research like help think about region in new ways? Or think about Pacific world or isms, these kind of isms that we really like, right? Pan-Americanism, whatever. Why don't we flip and go Gustavo first, and then Keiji.
Sure. So I'm my PhD is in geography, and I have a background in political theory and philosophy and religion. And now I'm in the Department of Global Studies, passing through environmental studies. So for me, field and discipline are, you know, I like working without those boundaries. And for me, it's less about thinking in terms of Latin American studies or Asian studies or Asian American studies. It's more about thinking in terms of picking up on some real material, political, environmental, social problems that we have, and then find what is it that's useful for us to think about it. What are the useful literatures and so forth and so on. That's how I approach field making or field thinking about them. And I think that for me, I'm born and raised in Brazil, and I'm from an urban middle class. But before I started to learn a lot about China and think about East Asia and Latin America relations, I was really interested in land politics. I was really interested in environmental politics in Brazil. And I'm from a region where agribusiness is king. And I understood that, look, you know, I had great colleagues who were very interested in the kind of like urban politics of São Paulo, great scholars of urban studies. But when I'd sit down to talk with them and I'd say, okay, well, let's talk about agrarian reform. And they're like, no está en pauta. Like, that's not an issue. For me, first, that's really condescending and dismissive. But really what matters is that that's such a problematic way of thinking about the problems in our society. We're never going to resolve urban problems if we don't address the rural-urban inequality, the history of that, and so forth and so on. So, you know, we have a modern agribusiness, a modern society built upon colonial distribution of land, built upon colonial relations of labor, and so forth and so on. Those matter. So what happened is that I was in Brazil and I was looking at those questions, and suddenly, to understand the largest market, the biggest investor coming in, trading and so forth, really mattered. And few people had much knowledge, like Heidi was saying, about China. Like, why? It's like, oh, it's too many people. They need a lot of food. Like, that really problematic and simplistic way of understanding why there is such a huge demand for this agribusiness product, why there's so much capital coming from China. You know, how do they go from being a ravaged country by civil war and all that to become a massive force of global capitalist transformation? That is extremely important to understand, to address those questions in Brazil. And yet, people were largely unprepared because of various issues. Maybe we can talk more about issues in different types of academia, not just by field, but even by funding and so forth and so on. But I think that what I then started to find when I did start to ask those questions, when I did start to engage those problems, was really a problem of US imperialism. or Euro-American imperialism, which is this kind of this American and exceptionalist narrative, and an idea that places, for example, even very progressive views, like a critical race theory, critical race scholarship, that uses US specific lenses to analyze the kind of social frameworks of, say, Brazil-China encounters. And that's problematic, you know, like there's a lot more to it. Or even when you look at in terms of political economic relations, and kind of see Brazil as, you know, like, oh, how does Brazil, like, so for the past several years, especially 2018 or 19, every month I'd get a call from a journalist or two being like, oh, hey, so the US trade war against China is great for Brazil, isn't it? And kind of reduce Brazil to this, like, oh, it's just a plantation that will benefit when, you know, China has to import soybeans from someone other than the US. So kind of placing Brazil and its relations with China, seeing China and its relations with other countries in kind of a Eurocentric, US-centric world, both in terms of its position in political economy and capitalism, but even conceptually, you know, even in terms of what kind of categories are we employing to look at notions of development, what kind of categories are we employing in terms of notions of modernity, what kind of categories are we employing in terms of notions of race and gender, that, you know, it's not that every place has its own particularity, but it's that, you know, it's quite limiting, I think, to just bring in these outside conceptualizations and expect them to apply. I don't know, I'm sorry if this was a bit rambly to go from like not really speaking to them about fields, but saying like how it is important to do this kind of work. I'd say like from the data up, you know, like theorize from the reality rather than apply theory to distinct realities.
Great. Thanks, Gustavo. Keiji.
Well, while Gustavo was talking and like listening to also what Heidi was saying, I started like thinking a lot of things, but I think there's many ways in which I think like trying to do this kind of different route, right, of a scholarly theoretical work can actually contribute to ways of imagining things. I think so. I think one thing is like, I think it's very important to be imaginative when you do research, especially in the humanities, in order for you to like kind of move away from, you know, the kind of received and repeated frameworks. And actually, first answering to the question of the importance of the Pacific to the Brazilian context, I actually don't think it's like it's you know, it's not a framework like a spatial imagination that actually I think is very much visited in Brazil, especially because there's no like actual contact, like physical contact with the Pacific territorially. So yeah, I mean, it's always been Atlantic, right? Actually, this is a question that Ana Paulina.
This challenged it though, right?
Yeah.
It challenges it. Yeah.
Yeah, it challenges. Yeah, totally. And Ana Paulina Lee has just actually published a book, right? Mandarin Brazil. She actually kind of tries to like work around this Atlantic Pacific dichotomy. It's a very inspiring book, also very good work. How, I actually forgot what was the exact question, so I'm just gonna kind of like yeah,
well, and you know, even my question might be like very Latin American studies and or, you know, history specific. My question was, you know, to what extent does bringing Asian studies or the study of Asia together with the study of Latin America or the study of Japan or China and together with the study of Brazil change the frame? What does it bring into view? You know, what do we gain from thinking about Brazil, or what might we gain from thinking about Brazil as part of the Pacific world, wherein Pacific means the presence of Asia, not literally the ocean there, but the presence of Asia, the long migration of Asian people, commodities, and cultural formations, blah blah blah.
I'm sorry.
Yes.
Or not, right?
So I think there are several things. I think one thing is, in this case, like when you think about race, I think as you're saying, the footnote story that you were talking, I think that is the most common experience when you bring Asia in this debates around Latin America or Brazil. It's a minor thing. Of course, we believe in the power of the minor, but in the usual hegemonic frameworks, the minoritarian is not that much. Especially within like a Brazilian studies context, it's not much very. It's always kind of like peripheral. And I think when you bring, in terms of issues of racial formations and racialities and ideas of race, when you bring in Asian, the debate around Asia to a Brazilian context, I think it does change a lot of the debate, of the conversation, right? And it also gives new vocabulary, and I'm thinking about critical theory. It can also kind of move away from the tropes of melancholy, tropes of loss, right? So it gives new, I think it inserts new vocabulary, new perspectives onto the debate of the racial formation of Brazil, of the idea of Brazil in general. Even if you think about it through the lens of absence, right? Like the lens of absence, the lens of invisibility. So that is one thing. And I think it also it challenges Brazilian exceptionalism in general, right? So I think this is an important aspect. I think in terms of the debate on race, even the debate against like the myth of racial democracy, the critical debate against, it kind of always looks back into a certain imagination of Brazil, which kind of tangentially, at least, kind of has some relation to Brazilian exceptionalism. So I think when you bring Asia, which is, a factual, historical process that happens, like the presence of Asia in Brazil or in Latin America in general, I think it kind of necessarily kind of has to open up other types of ideas of globality, right? When you think about Brazil, and specifically about film, I think I see that also Catherine Nanamo also asks about 30s and 40s Estado Novo and the Chizo Kamazaki's film 1980, Gaijin. I think there are. The presence of Asia or Asianness or yellowness, or Asian bodies in Brazilian film is very minor, and I think recently, because of also the rise of more structured and more organized and more visible rise of frameworks of Black studies within Brazil, I think this is also changing. But I think when you take even from a perspective of absence, right? I think when you think of the presence of, for example, Japanese cinema within the Brazilian, like the history of Brazilian film, you open a lot of different new perspectives onto how to understand power dynamics, race formations, and also the imagination of Brazilian cinema itself. And I'm thinking, not quite Shizuka Yamazaki, which is, I don't know if you know, she's like a woman director. Yeah, right? Yeah, so who made this film about the Japanese immigration, but also, for example, the presence of the Japanese Nouvelle Vague film movement within the marginal Ujiguru, the underground cinema, post-cinema novo in Brazil, right? So these are very important. I think these are very important, powerful, invisible presences in the imagination of how Brazil would become, what would imagine itself, or Brazilian filmmakers would imagine themselves as engaging with a global avant-garde, right? And it was, it was very common that they would look to Japan, and just recently, like in the last 2 decades, like what they've been called the new Novissimo Brazilian cinema, they would be starting to look at, for example, Southeast Asia, so there is a participation in a way of arranging, I think, references and things and imaginaries that I think Asia is a big part of.
Right. Gustavo, I don't know why you're apologizing. You had super interesting things to say. So enough of that. No apologies. Although I want to push back I'm going to say something in defense of area and defense of nation. I like the way that the the pivot to Asia in Latin American studies is an opportunity for rethinking what counts as Latin America. I care about what counts as Latin America, and I care because I live and teach in the U.S. Academy, and Latin America as a formation is something I think we would lose a lot if we let that go. All right, and I also think that the concept of Latin America has had many different lives within different Latin American countries. It's been, Hispanidad, it's been Solidaridad de las Américas, Nuestra América, it's been Third World Solidarity. There are iterations of Latin Americanness and Latin America that are really important to Latin Americans. Also, the pivot to Asia, what I care about most, or what I find most interesting, is the way that it challenges long-held truths about nationalism in Latin America, in Latin American academy, and in Latin American disciplines, and in Latin American popular conversations about race, history, power, labor. I love Ana Paulina's book, Ana Paulina Lee's book on Brazil. That's excellent. There's a number of great books that have come out of, studies of Asians in Latin America that really shift the conversation. Jason Oliver Chang wrote a brilliant book on Mexico and called Chino, Anti-Chinese Racism and the Mexican Revolution, in which he argues that anti-Chinese racism constituted a critical public sphere and kind of grotesque theater where anti-Chinese acts were absolutely central to the formation of revolutionary mestizaje, especially in northern Mexico. And there's several scholars who have worked on Chinese in Mexico, including Evelyn Huda Hart. But all these things, that is, pushing back against the romance of mestizaje in Mexico, and showing the ways in which, it's not just that it's whiteness, it's so much more than that. It's anti-blackness, and it's a kind of vicious anti-Asianness. Literally, as many of you here know, Chinese were ethnically cleansed from northern Mexico in the 1930s by the thousands. They were dumped over onto the US side of the border and shipped back to China. Many of them had never been to China, with their Mexican wives and children. We have iterations of that in Peru, right? There's ways in which the identity of Cholo authenticity is formed within the crucible of acts of anti-Chinese violence. One of the biggest massacre of Chinese people anywhere in the Americas ever took place in Brazil during the War of the Pacific, in Peru during the War of the Pacific, for a series of very complicated reasons. Anyway, so there's a way in which we are, it's the idea that Asians are part of Latin Americanness is, just beginning to, that's just starting in the conversation. There's so much work to be done. And I think, and this is really interesting. Historians have always known that there have been Chinese in the Americas, starting with the Acapulco trade, the Acapulco Manila trade in the 16th century and the 17th century. Again, those of us who work on labor knew about the plantation workers, we knew about the merchants, we knew about this and that, but footnote, this is what happens to the story, the national story of Mexico, or the national story of Peru, or the national story of Chile, no hay chinos en Chile, no hay chinos en Chile. Yeah, guess what? Hay mucho. Y había mucho chinos en Chile. Había muchísimo. And, so, or los pocos que habían eran muy importante, right? So it's like, oh, wow. All of a sudden, it's a new story. It also, I love the way that the new study of Asians, and especially, well, I'm working on Chinese, but Chinese in the Americas, challenges in Latin America, gently challenges from a position of solidarity, enduring narratives within Asian American studies of, the kind of exceptionalism of the US American experience. And some transnational Asian American studies has tried to make that transnational kind of point by saying like, well, actually, the experience and the situation of contract workers in Cuba and Peru was very similar on a close continuum with what was going on in California. And it's like, if anybody has studied Chinese plantation labor in Peru and Cuba in the 19th century, it was nothing like what was going on in California. So, which isn't to say that there wasn't vicious anti-Chinese racism underlying labor regimes in California, right? But there's this way in which, there's I'm always pointing this out to my students. If you grew up in the United States and you had the opportunity to engage Asian American studies, at say the high school level or whatever, you'd get the very important story of Asian American immigration, diasporic experience, and struggle within the U.S. nation state, right? But at certain points in the 19th century, far more people from China are ending up in Cuba and Peru than are going to San Francisco or New York. So, precisely because of the Exclusion Act, right? So there's lots of ways in which it's not that we want to I'm not interested necessarily in getting rid of area. I think there's lots to be gained from thinking about Latin America or thinking about Mexico as a nation or, thinking about the formation of the United States. But the transnational move allows us to really bring new things into focus, and that's exciting. So, Gustavo, let me go back to you if you wanna chime in again on your own paradigm.
I really appreciate what you were saying. I think it really makes a lot of sense. And I think that exactly what you just mentioned about, studying Chinese workers in California and in Peru that illustrates exactly what I was trying to criticize before. That you cannot just assume that Asian American relations and paradigms from people who have studied this in the US context will automatically be the same in Peru or elsewhere and across history. And I think I just wanted to add to that previous question that I still don't think I answered so well, but I think that there's so much value also in the other way around, into rethinking how East Asia and even its nation states have been constructed through engagement, you might not want to say with Latin America, but as part of the same process of formation of Latin America.
Yes.
So I was fascinated when I was doing, some of my research and reading back onto it to find that, like Keiji and I and Felipe, like Brazilians know like why our country is named this way. It's like, the Pau Brasil, it was kind of like that resource colonial extraction kind of a thing from the Portuguese. But where does the name China come from? China. It also comes from Portuguese pirates or navigators or explorers, if you prefer, who were using Qing, who were using those previous terms from the Marco Polo era, but it was Ming Dynasty. So there's this great story, 1534 or 36, I'm sorry, I'm not a historian, but the Portuguese guy gets straddled, arrested, and he's not able to get to mainland because they only do trade in the outer islands. And he's asking, where's China? We hear so much about this. I'm like, what? This is Ming. This is the Ming Empire. They don't know what China is. And then the imagination of China as a nation state, at least from what I've read, the earliest documentations of it seems to really have the same root in the same moment, in the same process of imagining Brazil as a nation state. And I think that that's also so fascinating because so much of the way that I see Asian studies being done they seem to just kind of gloss over Portuguese imperialism and even Spanish imperialism. Yeah. And the Philippines, as a Hispanic nation, is also awkwardly treated. So the same way that, you know, for our group, I guess it's more obvious how, you know, we see Asianness as part of Latin Americanness. I think that there's so much, even more space, even more need for that kind of provocation for our colleagues who see themselves doing Asian studies, or even for Asian scholars themselves. And that, I think, it illustrates exactly, I think, Heidi, what you were pointing to. And I should have just said that as my answer from before, instead of whatever ramble I did.
I wanted to, well, let's see. I do have another. I do want to ask the more personal question. I'm interested if personal trajectory that brought. Oh no, my internet's unstable. I hope you can still hear me. That brought you to, you know, studying what you're studying. I can share briefly in my case that, you know, again, my first two books they're on Chile and women workers in Chile, not Asian descended women workers in Chile, also a transnational history with the US I did, blah, blah, blah. My pivot to looking at labor, really, well, first inspired by teaching world history, where I was responsible for drilling, where it was my job to learn a lot more about history of China and, you know, history of all kinds of different things. And then there's a kind of just brazenness that comes with that. Like, hey, yeah, we're intellectuals. We can consume and be omnivores of other literatures. Let's go do it. That fiction, Amitav Gasha's trilogy on the Ibis, which is this brilliant, you know, oh, you must read it if you haven't. It's a Dickensian, you know, kind of just swashbuckling, kind of fabulous joyride of a novel about Lascars and, you know, workers on the high seas of during the opium trade between India and China. And anyway, it's fabulous. That inspired me to think a lot of the connection between Latin America and China and blah, blah, blah. And then the other, probably most important one, are my students. Teaching here at UCI for 25 years, you know, we have a very significant Asian American student body, and I would have many Asian American students among my many other students who would that their, you know, their ancestor from China didn't come through Havana, and they were there for, you know, a generation before they left for the United States, or came from Hermosillo, Mexico, or through Callao, Peru, and the kind of the triangulation, the, you know, whatever, the very, you know, the Asian Americans in California and Asian Americans in the United States, of them have studied through Latin America to begin with. Now, you know, scholars of immigration, they know this, that's nothing new for them. But again, for this person, this formed in the 20th century, you know, doing the national history of Chile during the Cold War, and then branching out a little bit to think about the West, that was like, wow, okay, that made me think really differently. And of course, they were for reading in Latin America, right? And I could point to Evelyn's work and, you know, now some new stuff as well, but they are hungry to be included in those national stories, actually, you know, of Mexico or Peru or, you know, Chile or whatever. So that's part of my personal arrival at this topic. How about you, Keiji?
Well, I feel like I'm closer maybe to the position of the student stories that you were talking about. Yeah. Being a Japanese Brazilian, born and raised in Brazil, you know, very I mean, studying film and very interested, you know, in the history of Brazil and the history, I mean, all the, like the humanist disciplines and the history of Brazil, the history of Brazilian cinema. Of course, just by occupying this position, you already kind of have a certain like a certain frame, certain epistemological angle that you, for example, you are reading the modernists in Brazil, and when one Asian appears, for example, that stands out so much. You know, I think that the experience of like the cultural formation of a Brazilian from like Asian descent. So these experiences of encountering minor references, you know, and understanding like writing, like reading, I don't know, Mario de Andrade. I was just like this like last novel that was published after recently. You will find several references, for example, to the Japanese in São Paulo, you know, in the early 30s. And then it's very easy that this doesn't get noticed, right? If you don't have that specific angle. So I think this is one thing, right? And then there was also another thing that was the usual conflation within the general like national discourse of you are either, you're not part, of course, you're not part, there's no Asia component in the national history, or Asia and Asian Brazilian are conflated, right? So there is also this other side that actually kind of made me I've always been interested in like the avant-garde experimental cinema from Japan, from Brazil, from like Latin America in general. And of course, Japanese cinema always kind of called my attention. And so kind of like trying to, you know, kind of having this curiosity of exploring more Asian studies in general, that framework, the Asian history, you know, and theories coming from Asia also, which was 100% absent when you study cultural theory, for example, in Brazil. You know, so that was also something else that actually made me want to, for example, go to do my PhD in the US, right? Because I mean, my PhD was basically a comparatist PhD. I was gonna go to it was a complicated story of institutional going back and forth, but I ended up in Cornell doing Asian studies, and and of course I was doing Asian studies institutionally, but I was doing Latin American studies. I was film studies, you know, I was actually all over the place. But that actually came from this need to understand a little bit more critically and theoretically, right, the processes of Asia. And then that also is still in Asian studies, it was very difficult to find that bridge to Latin America. So that part was always like the effort. But I think this is, yeah, these are like in terms of the personal, how I arrived at this this little field. I think this is like the personal motivation.
Yeah, Gustavo.
So I was setting out to, I wrote a master's thesis on theories of justice and democracy, and I was looking at Latin America. I was especially interested in Bolivia. That was kind of when Morales and that stuff was, you know, still kind of, and I took a year off and I was working with the MST, the Landless Peasant Movement in Brazil. And I was working as a translator. And I applied to the PhD in geography to study land politics and environmental politics associated with that. And I got accepted based on that. But, you know, after or through that, at some point along that way, we had a La Via Campesina conference in Brazil. And I was working as a translator, but I was translating for the global leadership of the peasant movement. And in that really privileged space, over a lunch break, we were having lunch, and I had the opportunity to ask João Pedro Stedley. You know, I was like, hey, you know, looks like I might be able to go back to the US and get some funding to do a PhD. What would be useful for the peasant movements? What would be useful for agrarian reform in Brazil? What would be useful for me to contribute to? And I still remember to this day, he turned to me and he said, oh, the last thing we need is another white middle-class kid coming from the outside to tell us who the peasantry is and how to do agrarian reform. We can do that, by ourselves. Thank you very much. We have second generation in the movement, third generation who are getting their own PhDs and becoming lawyers and so forth and so on, who can do that kind of work. But even those folks struggle to get access into the state, access to the corporations, access to be able to really understand from the inside, what are the new dynamics of agribusiness? What are the new dynamics of capital that are unfolding? We need to understand that better so that we can strengthen our own strategies, so that we can strengthen our own movement building. And that was 2009, 2010. Aftermath of the global financial crisis, I don't know if you people remember, but food prices had spiked, like the price of rice in some countries increased 400%, the whole, at least people in my world, everyone was up in arms about. Good night, Evelyn. Thank you so much for coming and for the comments. And for the others who have to go too. So that was.
Thank you, Evelyn.
That was the time people were talking about a land grab,
Yeah.
in that moment of crisis. And the big bicho papon, the big evil boogeyman was China with their huge population and huge appetite. So I was like, okay, well, if I'm not going to study, peasant movements, if I have to study capital, what are the new dimensions of capital that are going on? It was, for the first time ever, after 2009, China became Brazil's #1 trade partner. In 2010, China became, if not the first, then the second largest foreign direct investor. There was a huge boom of investments. The pré-sal in the not just ag, not just food, but oil and so forth and so on. Suddenly, like, it hit Brazilians like a brick that China matters. That China is not just that communist, bicho papão out there. It's that, like, we need to think this. And then that's why I started to study that. And then even more personally, I started to, one of my tasks as a translator for Via Campesina was supporting a group of Chinese social movement folks who were doing a social movement exchange with the MST. So I got to work directly with folks from Taiwan, Hong Kong, and mainland China. And that got me very into personal connections and so on. I started. Oh, and the final thing, I know I'm rambling too much, but and then I read Gilberto Freire, China Tropical. I mean, Gilberto Freire has a lot of problems, but that's exactly the kind of thing that then blew my mind, to rethink Brazilian history as deeply, not just comparable to, but deeply tied to, the formation of East Asia as well, and all that.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, no, that's great. I realize it's getting late, and we are starting to lose people, and I'm conscious of how zoomed out people are, but I would like to just open it now for stories, questions from anybody else who's here. Sorry, we lost Abby for ago. She's on the East Coast at Brown, so anyone else, please just unmute yourself. We're small. I mean, Evelyn did give us a lot right there. And of course, in her inimicable way, she's of course writing another fabulous study about empire. We have another one. Maria Angeles? Hi, you want to unmute yourself?
Not particularly, but here I am.
Oh, thank you. All right.
I'm very shy.
Okay.
I'm very interested in this relationship between Latin America and Japan in particular, because I have, like I said in my text here, I have some family history of, having some relatives, who are first generation immigrants there in Venezuela, and also through martial arts, which I practiced growing up, and now here in the US. And my sensei is writing a book, or wrote a book, on Maeda, who's basically the father of Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, arguably, even though the Gracie brothers are the ones who are credited with this invention, but they studied with him and, you know, kind of came up with the form, but he was totally erased from history. And so one of the contentions of my sensei is that, you know, this history needs to be known. And so I'm particularly interested, Keiji, when you were talking about minoritarian histories, like, you know, how do we approach the issue of identity in Latin America and its main history, but then, you know, seen through the lens of the minoritarian kind of approach, and like how do we incorporate, you know, the messiness, you know, that it is, you know, to incorporate this history. So anyway, so just some thoughts on how I engage with or how I'm engaging or thinking about this. It's through that kind of lens. And also through my relatives who, you know, always, you know, felt like they were an absolute, you know, kind of cero a la izquierda, you know, like, you know, not
invisible, right? Not even a foot.
So it's not really a question, Keiji, as much as it is, you know, maybe you can have, you know, more things to say about, you know, looking at that approach to history in Latin America, minoritarian history.
Yeah, well, I mean, I'm not a historian, although I do deal with historical materials. So usually my goal when I look at the historical materials and I mean, films and photography, you know, images in general, moving or still, is that it's always kind of trying to kind of come up with a theoretical proposition, and like looking specifically at mediation of images. So, but actually, you're just like the things that you were saying, thinking of also what Gustavo was just saying in terms of the I mean, you mentioned briefly it wasn't in the in the sense of Brazil, Russia, India, China, but I was just thinking, this is random, this is really digressive. I was just thinking about the current issue of vaccine geopolitics. I don't know if I don't know if you're talking about, if you've been thinking about this. It's intense, and also in relation to like the rise of these are very kind of really random connections that I'm making right now, but the rise because I feel there's a relation between. So I'm going back to Lula era, Lula and Dilma era, and the entrance of a lot of Black students in the universities in Brazil, and how this kind of like later on, which is right now in this past recent years, how this actually made theoretical frameworks that are coming from Black studies, you know, and critical race theory to rise in Brazil in the public debate, in the academic debate, and it's really like something new. How it gained visibility, like these type of discourses and like lenses to look at history. Although it wasn't absent, of course, there is a long history of, you know, Black studies in Brazil, but I think it gained more visibility recently, and it's directly related to the people who actually gained access to academic work in Brazil through the policies of the Lula era. And with this, which is interesting, with this, the thinking and trying to theorize and looking back at the experience of like minoritarian populations such as Japanese, which are racialized, right? Like racialized minoritarian populations and its insertion in Brazil, racial formations, Brazilian national discourses, and Brazilian history has also gained visibility recently, which is interesting. And it is directly related to the rise of critical race studies through Black studies. So one thing that I think I heard Claire Kim actually from UCI, she'll say a long time ago, I think one way of looking, you know, if you're trying to like have a certain different angle and kind of move away from the minoritarian, majoritarian type of dichotomy in order to understand racial formation and racializations of within a culture, you know, in a national formation, for example, in the Japanese Brazilian case or Asians in Brazil, usually thinking with Black studies helps. You know, I think it also illuminates some problems, issues and questions that are very difficult to address, for example, through the lenses that I acquired in my education in Brazil, which was much more Eurocentered, or through the like traditional triangle formation of Brazil. So I think this is this is something that I was like bricks, like just joining everything that people were saying. I had this in mind, how this actually this national policies of education in Lula and Dilma era actually made a lot of difference in the ways that people can look, you know, into Brazilian history. You know, because in Brazil, it's not even Black studies had a lot of space before.
Keiji and Gustavo, one thing that perhaps you can illuminate us better than other people, at least the ones that are right here right now, but it's the issue of how, I mean, both of you Keiji had worked in Japan, and Gustavo, you have worked in China. You have stayed a long time there as well. To what degree scholars there, based either in Japan or in the regions of China that you have worked, Gustavo, address Latin America as an area through which disciplines or through which research agendas? You talk a little bit about that, Gustavo, regarding international relationship, for instance, but just to getting more center on Japan and China on that.
Yeah, great question.
In short, I would say that, you know, there's some people, there are exceptions, but I think that the main limitation is that, and I'm speaking mostly about Chinese academia right now, is that there's not much emphasis on fieldwork. There's not much emphasis on going to the place, living there. On the end of Chinese academics is less because of resources. Like Brazilian scholars who have trouble studying, say, China or East Asia, oftentimes because it's very difficult to get resources and the time to do this kind of transnational fieldwork that I've been really fortunate to do. On the end of my Chinese colleagues is less because of that, it's just because that's less of a practice, even for their domestic studies. For social sciences, mainly, I think that really hamstrings it a lot. Now, there are some people who are doing more cool, exciting new work, but it still seems to be mainly about different ways of looking or interpreting. Unfortunately, I don't see there being so much of a practice yet of developing, say, studies pertinent to Latin America or relations beyond the kind of diplomacy and international relations kind of framework.
Although I get every single year I get asked to teach in China Latin American history. So it's not about scholarly production, right? But there's this kind of like, you know, China is developing its own area of studies. And right now it needs to outsource it and rely on North Atlantic and Latin American intellectuals. But they're busy being, you know, like, we're the world leaders and it's important for us to know the world that we're going to lead. So, you know, and super interesting to me that China is, you know, I can recognize your dissection or your description of the lack of emphasis on fieldwork and ethnographic research is very consistent with what my colleagues in Chinese history say about academic right now. That's for political reasons. So it's interesting. Okay, Keiji, you should answer Alex's question because do they care about Latin America and Japan?
Yes. Well, within film studies, not really. You'll have some. I mean, as far as I can remember, you know. As far as I can remember, it's like the Deleuzians would have that 68 generation readers in Japan will have some reference to cinema novo, through the lens of, the French film theory that came out of that generation, because they would also address those, right? So you have some Glaube Hasha here and there, talking about the time image or something like this, but it's not very proud. When I was a researcher there at the University Meiji Gakuin in Tokyo, which is like an important, very important film department in Japan, there wasn't, no one really knew what Brazilian cinema looked like. So it was kind of like an absence of references in general. And I think in terms of more like area studies, there are the departments like Luso-Brazilian studies departments. I don't really know how they circulate within Japan. I don't know what is the impact that they have within the general academy in Japan. And I know some of the scholars because also they would come to Brazil sometimes. But I really cannot tell what is the reach, of Latin America within beyond.
There is in all the major universities of Chile and Peru, increasingly in Mexico and Argentina, there are Confucian institutes. So China.
Uruguay.
Oh yeah, in Uruguay, right? I mean, I'm sure in Brazil, right?
They are right. They are arriving in Brazil right now.
And that's about that. I mean, whatever. It fascinates me that this is China's. If the United States did this, from 1945 till the collapse of the Soviet Union, when all of a sudden it stopped caring about Latin America, then, which is good for Latin America. Okay, bad for Latin American studies funding, not necessarily bad for people in Latin America. But China is busy putting institutional spaces in universities, right? Not only to have the proper study of China done, but also, I mean, hey, they're intellectuals, so also to create a body of knowledge about the places that China is influential in. So they're world leaders. This is what world leaders do. The British did it, the Americans did it, the Chinese are doing it.
Yeah.
Any other comments from the? Oh, I'm sorry, I cut you off, Alex.
Joseph.
Could I ask a question into that rubric? Thank you so much for this. This is really fascinating, and I'm learning a lot from this. I work in, the transnational Asian American studies. I read a lot about Korean political economy, but I'm more situated disciplinarily in Asian American studies. And I'm kind of really interested in this last conversation about the Confucian Institutes and China as like the sort of rising hegemon. And I'm curious. I mean, one of the things I think a lot about in the context of Asia and in terms of a regional logic is the kinds of shuffling and recalibration that's sort of happening in this transitional moment. As China ascends and the US isn't quite dead, although mostly. And so I'm just curious for me, it's a really interesting time, not in terms of, I mean, it seems like the sort of the overall trajectory is clear and what's happening is clear, but there's a lot of really interesting kind of transitional reshuffling, specifically in the way regional networks are organized. And so on the one hand, I see, obviously the trend line towards Chinese dominance is fairly clear, but I wonder if there's I'm kind of just curious about the affordances of this particular moment of transition in Latin America. There's clearly a lot in thinking in Asian regional context, but I'm curious, and maybe even more specifically, I think a lot about the failure of the US-led version of the TPP. I know a version of that gets passed with a lot of Latin American countries involved. I'm just kind of curious if there's thoughts about this particular moment and its particularity and its possibilities for critical thought, even though many of these moments are maybe be immediately foreclosed. But thank you so much for this conversation.
Thanks, Gustavo. KJ, do you want to chime in on that or anything else? Thanks, Joseph, for the question.
Hello?
Hi.
Oh, sorry. I had a problem with my sound. I was thinking about the book The China Boom by Ho-Fung Hung. I think we need to be careful about these ideas of hegemonic competition, of China becoming the new hegemon, taking that for granted. I see problematic parts of that narrative. One being that US companies, US capital continues to be largely dominant. A lot of what is Chinese economic power is actually foreign companies operating there. There's a lot of on-lending capital that comes from the West, cycles through there, comes back out. The position in world systems analysis is still intermediary. It's not the place that controls the highest technology, intellectual property, and so forth and so on. A lot of what passes for soft power is, I'm sorry, just like terrible. I mean, currently, I'm not going to name names, but in a country that I'm very familiar with, well, it's impossible to hide it, in Brazil, the communications director of the Chinese embassy doesn't speak Portuguese, speaks Spanish, and writes, like, it just doesn't make the country look
That's
good.
what the Americans and the British do too. They never arrive speaking Portuguese, they only speak Spanish.
In Brazil?
No, I'm saying this is the problem.
I mean, I guess what I'm pointing to is, like you said, Heidi, like, yeah, they are bringing a lot of scholars from Latin America, from the US. They are building, but this leads me to the final point, which is that it's largely about like kind of replicating the kind of US model. It's so much about catching up and replicating that kind of framework very uncritically. So and again, there's great exceptions and there's great critical scholars, but by and large, I find that the worldviews from colleagues in China and worldviews that take for granted that, oh, China is definitely going to dominate the next century and so forth and so on, it's really not coming to grips carefully enough with, I think, a lot of this, both political economics, structural limitations of that. Currency, I mean, we didn't even get into talking about currency, which is something that Ho-Fung does really well in that book. You know, the hegemony of the US dollar, even if a lot of the factories are in China now and so forth and so on. In a moment where capital is so much more financialized, industrial capital is no longer the leader in the way that the global political economy was structured by industrial capital beforehand. I mean, the possibility of future platform type capitalism in Chinese growing power there, I feel like it's still there as a possibility, but then again, it's still, I don't see yet that's not a done deal. And I think that we'd be shooting ourselves in the foot politically and intellectually by making assumptions then that would not be helpful. I'm sorry, I had problem with my computer audio before, so maybe I didn't catch the last part of your comment.
No, that's good.
Did I?
And thank you. That's a great comment. So
yeah, I can just ask one brief clarification to Gustavo. So do you think this is a problem of interpretation of like kind of imposing a paradigm of like US imperialism onto China, or do you think it is just like you're talking about the actual like situation right now and where it's headed? I don't know if my question is clear, but I was just curious because So you're saying
and this will be our last question. Okay. All right, you answer it, Gustavo. No, that's good. It's a great question. So
if I understand it correctly, Keiji, I think it's both. I think it's the way we're looking at this and what the material conditions are. But I feel like we're out of time. And I really, Joseph, I would love to follow up with you by email because I really lost the last third of what you were saying. But
yeah, please do. It's a much more complicated question. I appreciate your nuancing the story of China's rise. It was more of a shorthand, but we precisely wanted to complicate that story. So that's the short end of it.
Yeah. Let's follow up.
Well, follow up on. You can find Gustavo, well, through UCI website. And
Yes.
I want to thank Gustavo and Keiji for their generous sharing of their work and their ideas, and great to meet you, Keiji, and I look forward to having you here and us having a proper, you know, second round, you know, in the fall when we can actually get together. So thanks to everyone who stayed the course, and thanks again, Alex, for organizing this. Stay tuned for future Latin American Studies Center events. We have a great film festival going on and other great events. So check out our website. Stay tuned for Director Alex Baruki's emails. So, okay. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Obrigado a todos.